Dude, just skip the whole thing, dude. Build it up, because that ability is just dog shit.
Time to buff Moira more.
Torb is in a terrible spot right now, and probably the worst hero in all of Overwatch.
Mercy Zenyatta really
Survived a discorded damage boost left click dash. No, I'm sorry. No, this hero's not real.
Well, now that we've done the strongest state of every hero, it's only natural we look at when each hero was just shit and when players were reasonably frustrated. The profile graphics in this video will have the current version of the hero in February 2022 at the time of recording this, and we'll compare that to the hero's weakest state in Overwatch 1 history. Listen fellas, the production quality has gone up this year. I'm no longer solo queuing everything. I have some help now with like the hero graphics, editing, research, so I want to thank Raid Shadow Legends for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. And here I thought 32 heroes was a lot for Overwatch. Raid has over 600 champions to collect and upgrade in their turn-based battle RPG for mobile and PC. Spend your Mystery, Ancient, Void, or Sacred Shards to summon new champions in the portal like this guy named Vogoth or this epic champion Luria. Unlike Overwatch, Raid gets constant updates. For example, there's a fresh rotation of the brutal Hydra boss and a ton of special events, like this Valentine's Day, where you can get your hands on brand new legendary champions. New players use my link in the description or scan the QR code to get a free starter pack worth $30 that includes Tay-Roll, Silver, XP boost, an energy refill, and an Ancient Shard to summon another champion as soon as you get in game. Rewards will be found in your inbox up here for the next 30 days only. Thank you, Raid, and back to the video. D.Va's release in May 2016 was by far the weakest iteration in her balance history. She slowly started getting buffs beginning on July 19th, 2 months later. She entered the game at 500 HP, a 100 health and 400 armor split, which is less than the 600 total HP you're used to today, but much better against small instances of damage because of all that armor. Her fusion cannons were actually a little bit stronger on launch, as they were 8 pellets with a max damage of 3, equating to 24 total damage before headshots. The downside was that she was slow as hell, with a 75% movement speed penalty while firing. As we go down to boosters, a bit more damage but on a longer 5-second cooldown, so a little give and take there. Now defense matrix is where it gets interesting. Instead of the resource meter today, Matrix used to be a single use ability on a 10-second cooldown. If you needed to flash it for like half a second and go back to shooting, too bad, you gotta wait 10 whole seconds to use it again. Defense Matrix was incredibly weaker because of that low uptime, despite it being much larger at 15 meters. As bad as Matrix was, it gets worse, as she didn't even have micro missiles as an ability altogether. 126 potential damage just not existing as part of her kit. Moreover, D.Va's ultimate used to take 4 seconds to explode instead of 3, so it gave enemies a lot more time to run away, and it used to do damage to herself, meaning if you didn't run, you were also screwed. These were truly the dark days of D.Va. Orisa was a hero that entered the game underappreciated when looking at her original profile, like, it wasn't that bad. She was weakest on release, March 21st, 2017, until buffs started coming in month after month until she became a solid pick by late summer in August. But going back to her release date, she started at 400 HP, a 200-200 split, lower than today's 450 HP with a 200-250 armor split. Her primary fire damage per bullet was actually higher at 12, but it doesn't tell the whole story because everything else about it was just functionally worse. Slow projectiles make it much harder to be accurate against targets further away, and we can see here that projectile speed was at 75 meters per second compared to today's 120 meters per second. Relatively speaking, that means each bullet today travels 60% faster than her original state. Her spread angle used to be at 1.5 degrees, but today it's tighter at 1.2 degrees, which looks like this. The red visual being how wide the bullets would spread, and the yellow is the 20% tighter spread of today at 1.2 degrees in 2022. Additionally, she used to have a 50% move speed penalty, whereas today she's only moving 30% slower. Everything else looks the same, except that she could not place her shield down while reloading, which has been a nice quality of life change since. Her halt was much better at this time because, number one, that 7.5 meter radius was way better than today's 5 meter radius, despite the longer cooldown. But number two, it was actually bugged where the halt projectile would touch walls and pull people through them. This stirred up some controversy when pro players used it in the Overwatch League, but that's a story for another video, which I'll link up in the top right. Her barrier on paper looks better at first with 900 health, but it was on a longer 12-second cooldown, and the actual size of it was much smaller, looking something like this, which doesn't give your teammates as much room to operate with. Fortify was decent with similar stats, except old Fortify had a 50% damage reduction, better than today's 40%, but you were still able to be headshotted. Something else that was important about old Orisa was that her head was actually 15% bigger and had to get tuned down at some point. And finally, we get to her supercharger, which cost about the same, only a 45 negligible point difference, but similar in all other regards. Rein's weakest state was about a year after release, where he was barely picked due to Winston D.Va dive becoming the meta. These dark days of Rein lasted between May 23, 2017 till July 27, 2017, all throughout Season 5. First, his hammer damage was lower at 75 a swing instead of 85. His shield was stronger at 2000, but Rein was much slower, with a minus 50% move speed penalty instead of only 30% today. But the real issue? Slowing effects which used to stack until it was finally changed in August of 2019, 2 years later. That meant the minus 50% move speed slow while the shield was up was compounded with whatever the hell Rein had to endure. Do any OG Rein players remember what it felt like to walk through 6 Symmetra turrets with shield up? It was like trying to run through molasses. He did not have a steadfast passive at all at this time, so he was able to get ping-ponged around, and his charge and fire strike have remained the same. Earth Shatter was cheaper to build at 1375 points, and used to knock enemies down for 3 seconds instead of 2.5, which are the only 2 things better than today's Rein. In 2017, Rein did not deal that 200 damage burst up close, and the hit registration was severely bugged with inconsistencies when shattering near objects, slopes, and inclines. This was a big problem. Fortunately, this was eventually fixed in 2018, but before that, playing Reinhardt during his weakest state was probably one of the most frustrating experiences that many tank players can relate to. Roadhog has had quite the journey in Overwatch 1 history in the first couple of years of the game, from having the buggiest hook of all time to not being played at all. His lowest point in terms of hero strength and pick rate at a miserable 5% was during that dive meta of Season 5 between June 20th, 2017 until August 29th that year. Hook 1.0 had been fixed months prior, but his identity of being able to punish poor positioning with a hook combo had been hindered as his bullet damage was decreased by 33%. Yes, 33%, from 9 damage a pellet to 6. When multiplying it by the total number of 25 pellets, his damage potential went from 225 down to 150, meaning he could no longer consistently one-shot 200 HP heroes unless every single pellet connected, with a few getting the headshot multiplier. To balance the enormous damage nerf at the time, he had to have his head hitbox reduced by 20%, fire rate improved by 30%, and ammo was bumped up to 5. He has since had his pellet damage increased by 10% relatively speaking, so it's sitting at 6.6 a pellet today, with improvements to spread randomization and rotation since, making it quite reasonable today. However, during his weak state, he did not have his unnamed passive where enemies receive less ult charge from damaging him. He was also unable to move while taking a breather, making him a sitting duck whenever he tried to use the ability, and anyone who's played Overwatch long enough knows how bad it is to stand still in this dynamic moving game. What made it worse was that it didn't even have the 50% damage reduction at the time. It was literally just a sit still, vape, and heal 300 HP ability. Whole Hog was a little cheaper at 2000 points back then, but it had 20% less knockup and did not reload his scrap gun ammo after usage, which has since been a nice minor buff to this ability. It's funny when thinking of Sigma's weakest state because he's arguably never really been weak, primarily because he was released in an overtuned form. His weakest state began on January 11th, 2021, when his barrier redeployment cooldown was nerfed to 2.5 seconds, which has since decreased back down to a modest 2 seconds in March, 2 months later. That's the last change he received, and Sig is still strong and being played regularly right now, over a year later. Winston has received the least amount of balance changes throughout Overwatch 1 history, most of them being buffs. With that in mind, it's easy to say his weakest state was also on release on May 24th, 2016, similar to a lot of other tanks we've seen here. He had 100 armor and 400 white health at the time, weaker than today's 150 armor and 350 white health split. His Tesla cannon and leap have never really been touched, but his bubble has received a few tweaks. It started off weaker at 600 HP with a duration of 6 seconds, and the cooldown only began when the bubble either timed out or was destroyed. This was a huge factor because if you placed a bad bubble and the enemy did not destroy it, you'd have to wait for the 6-second duration plus the 13-second cooldown, a total of a 19-second wait time to use it again in worst case scenarios. Compare that to today, where the cooldown immediately begins at a flat 13-second cooldown, giving it a near 33% potential increase in overall uptime. Primal Rage used to cost 1100 points, which was certainly cheaper, but it did not have the quality of life change of restoring his ammo after transforming back. Additionally, it only added 500 HP flat instead of topping you back up at 1000 HP if you transformed while anti-nated, making Ana a huge counterpick until this was fixed a year later. Wrecking Ball has received nerf after nerf and is in his weakest state right now, ever since the January 6th, 2022 patch that put Grappling Claw on a 6-second timer to stop the spin to win playstyle. Despite all that, he's actually still regularly played in D.Va ball comps with Brigitte in high-ranked games, primarily due to his versatility as a hero that doesn't need many resources to succeed. Again, here's his profile right now, and reference the Strongest State video to see where he was in his prime back in August of 2019 if you're curious. As we get to Zarya, it seems the pattern for tanks so far is that they were either weakest near the release of the game or right now, and Zarya falls in the latter category. Over the years, she's received nerf after nerf and is currently one of the least played tanks in Grandmaster. Her last nerf was on June 3rd, 2021, where her minimum damage went down from 95 to 75, making this the weakest state she has ever been. You can reference the Strongest State video to see what her prime stats look like back in 2016. Ashe's weakest state is a bit debatable, and I might get roasted in the comments for this, but I'm gonna go with her release state on November 12th, 2018. Her damage looked better in both her unscoped, scoped, and dynamite, plus all the other stuff, which begs the question, why was this her weakest state? To really understand that answer, you had to have played her back then to really feel how clunky she was. Newer Ashe players just wouldn't get it, but there was something really off about her animations, reload timing, and her gun just felt slow and awkward. To be honest, I didn't know how to quantify all her quality of life changes on this hero profile graphic, so I'll just go one by one in order. Despite all the big damage numbers, the clunkiness concern did not fall on deaf ears, as the first quality of life change came on August 13th, 2019, where her reload time per bullet decreased from 0.3 to 0.25 seconds. That looks minor, but remember it's all relative, and that's a relative 17% increase in reload speed, which certainly helped her keep bullets in the chamber and indirectly buffed her DPS as she didn't spend as much time reloading. Then, 8 months later, on April 6, 2020, she received massive buffs and fixes to her clunkiness. Shots would no longer queue up the next shot if pressed slightly before recovery had finished. You could also now shoot a scoped into unscoped shot without delay, which helped her fluidity. And the reload animation itself would begin much quicker after firing, independent of the reload time per round. 1 month later, she received her final quality of life change, which allowed her scoped shot to fully zoom in halfway through the animation instead of its conclusion. And this final adjustment to Ashe put her in her strongest state, like I mentioned in the Strongest State video. But since this video is about the hero's weakest state, hopefully all the highlighted changes I just mentioned justifies why I chose release state Ashe as her worst. In a dynamic moving game like Overwatch, Bastion is the only hero that literally has to sit still to be effective, making him incredibly unpopular on the ranked ladder. His weakest state began on November 15th, 2016 till the rework patch on February 27th, 2017. During this period, Bastion's recon form was identical damage-wise, but had a terrible spread angle of 2 degrees, which meant bullets would fly randomly in this range. In contrast, today, it's much more accurate at 1.2, which you can clearly see is a tighter bullet spread. Ammo count was significantly lower at 20, making recon form just bad, and mainly used as a filler until you could find a good spot to position. Before you can switch to sentry form, you need to reconfigure, which at the time had a 1.5 second transformation time, much slower than today's 1 second. What's interesting now that we get to sentry form is that it actually was better back then, because its bullet spread began tight before expanding, but today the spread starts wide, then tightens the longer you shoot, which is the complete opposite. Ammo count was lower at 200 instead of 300, but sentry form's best characteristic was being able to headshot enemies. That made Bastion super good in this one form and just meh everywhere else. This is why today he's had some of his power shifted around. Most notably, his Ironclad passive with damage reduction, which just straight up did not exist during his weakest state, really emphasizing his glass cannon 1 style nature. Self-repair was unlimited and you could use it as needed, but you had to be standing still while channeling it, which was a huge downside and one of the main reasons why he wasn't great in my opinion. Tank form, his ultimate, cost 2,075 points and used to grant him plus 150 armor upon activation, which was actually very good. Today, Bastion receives no bonus armor. However, Ironclad with 20% damage reduction effectively gives Bastion 360 HP if you want to look at it that way. Remember that self-repair didn't allow Bastion to move, and that included his tank form, which closed a bunch of his options. Cassidy's weakest state was back in 2016 near the game's release between June 14th and July 19th. Cassidy on release had a 70 damage per bullet Fan the Hammer up until it was nerfed to 45 per bullet on June 14th, and then had that patch on July 19th that allowed him to deal full damage at range, which was quickly nerfed 7 days later. That means Cassidy's weakest state was conveniently sandwiched between two of his stronger states in his balance history, where his stats look something like this. At the top, he had 200 HP back then instead of 225 today. Primary fire used to deal 35 to 70 with a higher minimum damage at the time. Fan the Hammer's damage ranged from 22.5 to 45, in which this minimum damage stat was higher, but it doesn't actually really matter, because why would you be fanning the hammer against someone 40 meters away? The maximum damage at 50 is what's important at close range, which is higher today. It also used to fire 15% slower. Combat roll used to be on a longer cooldown, and you could not use it in the air. Flashbang stun duration was shorter at 0.7 seconds instead of 0.8, which made it more difficult to double headshot enemies back then because they weren't stunned as long. Plus, there was a longer delay at 0.5 seconds before you could begin shooting after using it. Finally, when we get to Deadeye, it was cheaper at 1200 points, but the range was shorter and the ramp up worked a bit differently. You had to wait 0.8 seconds before being able to ramp up damage versus 0.2 seconds now, and it was a flat 275 damage per second rate after 1 second instead of it doubling to 550 after 1.5 seconds. It's a lot of numbers, but the take home point is that Deadeye was shittier, and you couldn't swivel your crosshairs once you fired. Doomfist's worst time was between January 16, 2020 till May 19, 2020, as this was the rough adjustment period with that longer rocket punch time, less passive shield, and a longer 0.35 second lockout after uppercut. This is what he looked like in his worst state compared to now. Nothing significantly different, to be honest, as he's not a great pick in ranked at the moment. Let me bring your attention to Seismic Slam. Seismic used to only knock up enemies, in contrast to today where it not only knocks enemies up, but it actually pushes them slightly away in front of them to make it easier to combo. Back then, the slow aerial Seismic Slam also had a longer acceleration time, making the overall ability clunkier. Doom's ult has all the same traits except that all his cooldowns are sped up by 100% while in the air, which is a nice change to allow Doom to all in with his abilities, ult for a few seconds, land, and be able to use all 3 cooldowns again. But he didn't have that back then in his bad state. Echo entered the game on April 14th, 2020, way too powerful. Her weakest state is right now, despite 5 straight nerfs, and boasts an insane win rate in high elo games, mostly due to hitscan heroes being incredibly weak at the moment with the fall off range nerf. This is her current weakest state profile, with her last nerf being June 3rd, 2021, where her duplicate cost increased by 15%. Not much else to say about this one. Even though Genji isn't played much today, there was an even darker period of him during double shield meta between August 13th, 2019 till December 10th, 2019. His shurikens on both the primary and secondary fire dealt 1 less damage, which was important for damage breakpoints, and ammo was at 24, meaning you could only fire 8 times before reloading versus 10 right now. His secondary fire was much slower at 0.75 seconds a pop, which translates to the shurikens firing 10% faster today, which feels way better. The spread angle used to be really wide and awful at long ranges because of the 12-degree spread versus 9-degree spread now, which is 25% tighter. As we moved to deflect, it only lasted 1.5 seconds and you could not manually cancel it, making it really predictable and easy to counterplay. His one saving grace was Dragon Blade at the 1680 cheaper cost and 10 additional damage per swing. If you were to play him in this weak state back then, you only really had one playstyle, which was to farm Blade and combo it with Nano, since he was really difficult to play outside of the Blade, as evident by all the red colored text. Hanzo's weakest state began on November 15th, 2016 up until May 23rd, 2017, a 6-month period. Looking at Stormbow, I really want to highlight the maximum speed his arrow would fire at. 78 meters per second is 40% slower than today's 110 meters per second, and that is a very big difference for a hero that's supposed to be a sniper. It was incredibly difficult to hit a target at long distance because of that slower travel time. Additionally, Hanzo's bow would cancel its charge when climbing walls, making him unable to challenge enemies on positions above where he'd want to climb to. Sonic Arrow was marginally better, but it came with a lot more downside to it on its duration and cooldown. He also just completely did not have Storm Arrows plus his lunge ability altogether. Okay, for the fun part, Scatter Arrow. Yes, it used to deal 75 per arrow times 6 arrows, equating to a 450 damage burst by simply activating and shooting the ability near an enemy's foot. The downside was that his entire identity revolved around whether or not he could hit a scatter arrow to burst a tank. If yes, great, you got value. If not, he was an average hero when it was on its 10-second cooldown, as evident by his other profile stats I highlighted earlier. Dragon Strike was a bit cheaper at 1500 points, while everything else has remained the same. There was one bug, however, where damage modifiers from Mercy or Ana would actually amplify the dragon's damage, allowing it to outpace the healing from Zen's Transcendence, for example. This really wasn't exploited at the time of his weakest state in 2016, but it is definitely worth mentioning since it did become an issue a few seasons later and it had to get patched out. Junkrat's weakest state began after the nerf to Global Ultimate Charge on November 15th, 2016 up until August 30th, 2017 the following year. His frag launcher used to fire much slower at 20 meters per second, but the nades were 50% bigger and bounce an additional time, making the sit still and spam style of Junkrat really popular. There was no reason to get in enemies' faces because his own grenade splash damage would hurt himself, discouraging Junkrat players from engaging at close range altogether. To make matters worse, Junkrat only had one single concussion mine, which was probably the biggest factor I considered when looking at all the different states he was in over the years. One concussion mine only hindered Junkrat's DPS and most importantly his mobility, as he was no longer able to double or even triple mine flank, for example. Players would often default to only using the mines as a DPS tool in most cases since it had no damage fall off being at 120 flat. His Rip Tire cost much less, like many ultimates during this era of Overwatch, but man was it slow, 20% slower to be exact. You can totally tell when watching this old footage of the tire. Its health and damage have remained the same over the years, except that the time to regain control of Junk after the tire is detonated or destroyed is much quicker these days at 0.9 seconds compared to the old 1.5 seconds of staring at the other camera, this part of the animation right here before you regain control. All in all, Junkrat was still dishing big burst damage, but was weak because you had no versatility in your playstyle and you were limited in your options. Mei was another underwhelming hero upon the release of the game from May 24th, 2016 till her first buff on September 2nd, 2016. The damage on her primary fire was a bit lower, but its effects were severely devastating, with a higher initial slow of 30%, more ammo in the gun, and the freeze lasted a little bit longer. However, she was unable to pierce through enemies at the time, so only one single target was able to be damaged or get slowed. When looking at her secondary fire, it was significantly worse, with crazy damage fall off at distance and costing 25 ammo per shot, allowing her to only fire 8 icicles before having to reload. Today she has a flat 75 damage no matter the distance, which makes her much better at mid to long range, and each shot only costs 10 ammo, translating to 12 icicles before having to reload despite the lower ammo count now. Cryo Freeze used to heal 25% less per second, and it did not restore any ammo while using it. Ice Wall, however, was very good, especially because it was before all the damage power creep over the years. 500 health per pillar was extremely difficult to burst through, plus it came off cooldown every 10 seconds, giving it a lot more uptime compared to 12 seconds today. As we get to her ultimate, this was an interesting one. Blizzard's cost has increased 61% since her first 2016 build, which is an insane comparison. However, what good is building a fast ultimate if it's dogshit? Well, despite the longer 5-second duration, its area of effect was 8 meters, making it way easier for enemies to escape its radius before being frozen. Plus, it used to not pierce barriers. That meant a Winston bubble could block its line of sight, for example. This version of Blizzard was incredibly difficult to get value despite the cheap cost. Pharah was a decently popular hero in the early days of 2016 Overwatch, but that was likely attributed to players just simply being unfamiliar with hitting flying targets. So despite the decent pick rate, Pharah was weakest by raw stats from May 24th, 2016 till buffs started rolling around on November 15th, 2016. Her splash damage minimum used to be lower at 10 when enemies were near the edge of its splash radius, along with a slower rate of fire. Concussive Blast was on a longer cooldown, Jump Jet didn't bring her up as high, and most importantly, her general move speed while hovering was at 0. No bonus speed in the air meant Pharah was really easy to shoot out of the sky since she couldn't move as fluidly. Rocket Barrage was 40% cheaper, which was nice, but the duration was slightly longer at 3 seconds, which actually made it worse. At first you'd think, wait, wouldn't a longer barrage equate to more damage? That's true, however, most targets are dead within the first second from all that damage, and being immobilized while channeling for any longer increases the risk of Pharah being killed. Finally, her barrage didn't come with any ammo restoration after usage. In short, the only thing that made old Pharah better was the rocket barrage cost and slightly improved hoverjet fuel refill. Reaper had a completely different mechanic back in 2016, tying his weakest state between November 15th, 2016 up until May 23rd, 2017. Right now, the Reaping passive is a flat 35% lifesteal, but back then, it was a 50 HP healing globe that only dropped when an enemy died. That meant it wasn't very helpful in a fight itself and was more of a heal after the fact, making him weaker in combat and a very snowbally hero by nature. His weapons dealt more damage per pellet at 7, equating to 140 damage if everything connected, but spread angle was 33% higher at 8 degrees, which looked like this. This made Reaper stronger at close range, but weaker at mid to long range. The argument on whether his weapons were better depends on your playstyle mostly, but I would say he's better now with the 6-degree spread angle and the weaker damage per pellet, simply because it makes Reaper more versatile at different ranges, and let's be real, he's still pretty strong up close. Wraith form was terrible back in 2016, as he only moved at 25% speed, it didn't restore his ammo, and he could not cancel it manually. It made timing it easy and predictable. Shadow Step took 0.5 seconds longer to finish the full animation, and it could not be used in mid-air at the time. Finally, with Death Blossom, it was 250 points cheaper, but everything else has remained the same fundamentally, except for not having your shotguns fully reload after usage. Soldier in 2016 wasn't terrible relative to the meta and hero pool at the time, but by raw numbers compared to today, that was his weakest state. This lasted from September 2nd, 2016 till November 15th, 2016, where his rifle damage got bumped from 17 to 20. Soldier is a relatively simple hero. See enemy, shoot enemy, with a heavy pulse rifle, and during his weak state, his rifle only dealt 17 compared to 20 today. He had 5 less ammo at 25 and had weapon spread. If anyone remembers the old Soldier, it would take about 6 shots before the 2.2 degree weapon spread would maximize, which encouraged players at the time to stop shooting to reset the recoil. It was a very on and off shoot and stop burst firing tempo, which in hindsight, much worse than today's straight vertical recoil, which is easy to control. Other parts of his kit weren't really touched, except Helix was on a longer cooldown and Biotic Field healed a little bit more. Visor was significantly cheaper at 1660 points, however, shooting targets at long ranges would suffer from fall-off damage at the time, making the long-range aspect of it much weaker. Sombra was a hero released underpowered back on November 15th, 2016, up until a few buffs rolled around 2 months later on January 24th the following year. Her machine pistol's weapon spread was at 3 degrees, which is 25% wider relatively speaking, which made fighting enemies at mid-range inconsistent. Stealth used to only last 6 seconds instead of infinite today, with only a marginal increase in movement speed. This forced you to make really quick decisions because you had no time to waste. What's worse was that Translocator was also on a timer at 15 seconds instead of infinite as well. Additionally, the cooldown of it only began after you teleported back, which prevented you from doing any sort of the double Translocator tech that's available in Sombra's arsenal today. The only upside back then was that it had no health, meaning it wasn't breakable by enemies. Consequently though, you weren't able to manually destroy it yourself. Hack had a lot of changes since 2016. First, it lasted 6 seconds on a target, which is better. However, the entire hack animation was longer at 1 second, and the overall cooldown was 50% longer at 12 seconds when compared to today's 8 seconds. Cooldown being halved when hacking health packs is a nice change now, which wasn't available back to old Sombra, forcing you to wait a full 12 seconds if you decide to hack the Mega. But Sombra's playstyle was much different back then. You see, my new Overwatch players, Sombra used to be able to gain ultimate charge from teammates taking her hacked health packs. It would count as her healing her teammates for 250 HP each pack. So you'd have situations where you were able to gain a lot of ult charge really quickly, and sometimes while dead. Her EMP was cheaper at 1250 points, had a quicker cast time, and the hack duration lasted a bit longer. In short, Sombra's old style with the grabbing health packs for ult charge promoted a very annoying playstyle as everything revolved around building a fast EMP, and this actually depended on the map and the health pack location. Despite that aspect of her being strong, everything else about her kit was worse. Her pistol, stealth, translocator, and hack. Symmetra was another hero that had her weakest day during the early days of Overwatch on May 24th, 2016 till November 15th, 2016. At this time, Symmetra was a support, believe it or not, except she had no healing capabilities, just a legitimate support hero by supporting her team with shields, teleporters, slows, and other utility. She's actually had another minor rework before turning into a DPS hero, but we'll focus on her initial 1.0 state. From the top, her HP used to be at 200 instead of today's 225 with that extra 25 shield health. Photon Projector Primary Fire used to deal way less damage, only dealing a maximum of 120 damage per second at level 3 charge. However, the mechanic was different back then, as it used to latch onto enemies as long as they were within 5 meters. Today, her damage is much higher, capping out at 180, but it's a tracking-based laser beam. The range is also longer at 12 meters and allows you to slowly reload your ammo on barriers to compensate for its lower 70 ammo. If you have decent tracking aim, the latching effect dwarfs the relative damage on today's Photon Projector. Her secondary fire used to be called Energy Ball, which did slightly more damage, but it was not single target, as it was able to pass through enemies. The only downside was that the projectile speed of the orb was slow as hell at 10 meters per second, which was easy to dodge if you were paying attention. Her sentry turrets used to be at 1 HP, so you could just breathe on them as Winston to quick clear, and its damage and slow effects were lower. However, you were able to deploy 6 of them, so mathematically it is similar, because 6 turrets times 25 damage is 150 DPS with a 60% slow versus today's 3 turrets times 40 damage, which is 120 DPS with a 60% slow as well. Where things get spicy is this old ability called Photon Shield, which was just an ability you'd use on every ally as often as possible to give them plus 25 shields that lasted until they died. That was it. That was the extent and rationale of her being in the support category. Her teleporter today was what eventually replaced the underwhelming Photon Shield ability, but back then the teleporter was actually her ultimate. Looking at her old teleporter ultimate, its availability was limited because you had to build it compared to today where it's on a 10-second cooldown. It was also easily breakable at 200 HP compared to 300 today. And it used to only have 6 uses, that's it, compared to today's infinite usage. You didn't have a limit on its range though, so a lot of people trolled the team by placing it off the map. Calling it underwhelming was an understatement. Today's Photon Barrier didn't exist, so we've crossed it out on this hero profile. And yeah, this was old Symmetra 1.0. Weak as hell, and you were considered a thrower if you played her back in the day, which amplified the demand for her eventual rework. Torb is another fun hero when talking about his weak state because he was also fundamentally different back on release in 2016 up until some minor changes started kicking in on November 15th, 2016. This was Torb's 1.0 build as a defense hero before his rework. From the top, his HP used to be at a flat 200 white health, which is lower than today's 250 HP with 50 extra armor. His rivet gun hasn't seen too much change. The primary fire used to be a little slower at 60 meters per second, which did change the way the projectile arced, along with a slightly longer reload time. His shotgun used to actually deal a bit more damage, however it costed 3 ammo, allowing Torb to only fire 6 times compared to 9 today, only costing 2 ammo each. For his turret, it's not really a fair comparison to say which one was better or worse with the red and green color because they actually function differently, and that's why I use the light blue. Okay, so today his turret is 250 HP flat, but back then you had 3 levels of turret and it would always start at level 1 with 150 health and only deal 2 rounds of 14 damage per second. You had to swing your Forge Hammer 5 times to upgrade it to level 2, which then brought up the base health to 300 with 4 rounds a second, matching today's turret with a little bit more health. The level 3 turret with 800 health and firing 9 rounds per second was only accessible if you used his old Molten Core ultimate, which only cost 1300, granted 300 armor, and buffed his overall rate of fire. Now let's zoom into his old passive at the time called Scrap Collector, in which 25 scrap would spawn on a dead enemy up to a maximum of 200 scrap. The scrap would be used for his other ability called Armor Pack, which granted enemies 75 armor and cost 50 scrap, making Torb an honorary Brig, like father like daughter. He did not have his overload ability at all since this was what eventually replaced the Armor Pack and Scrap passive mechanic, along with Molten Core being completely different today with the orange sticky stuff. All in all, 2016 Torb 1.0 was a decent hero to play on defense once his turret was set up, but that was his glaring weakness. You were considered a troll if you played Torb on attacking sides of maps because it was way too difficult to get your turret set up in an aggressive spot. Plus you had to spend 5 seconds hammering it to upgrade. Additionally, you had to rely on scrap, which only dropped when enemies died, meaning you'd have to wait until fighting was already happening before being able to use the mechanic altogether. Tracer has received some of the fewest balance changes throughout Overwatch 1. However, there was a period between May 3rd, 2018 until August 13th, 2019 where she was weak relative to all her other states. That's over a year and 3 months. At this time, her damage falloff on pulse pistols kicked in earlier at 10 meters, meaning enemies beyond that range would receive less damage per pellet. It boiled down to just being weaker at mid-range. Her blink was also missing the cool mechanic of traveling up inclines and slopes. For Pulse Bomb, it was marginally cheaper at 1125 points versus 1260 today, but the damage was a lot lower at 300. Now that was significant in a few matchups such as Bastion, Doomfist, and a few tanks. Widowmaker has been a problematic hero throughout Overwatch as she was able to one-shot enemies across the map. People don't like one-shots. She has received nerf after nerf to give her more weaknesses, but they did their best to try to keep that one-shot sniping identity, and thus her weakest state was between October 29, 2020 till July 1st, 2021. That October was the patch that brought her down from 200 HP to the 175 today, making her extremely squishy and diveable if she wasn't careful. There isn't much difference between the weakest state of Widow versus the Widow today, with only the fall-off range just being a little bit worse at 60 to 85 meters compared to the 70 to 100 meters today. That 60 meter fall-off did affect her in a few common map sightlines like Ilios and Junkrat. Ana has gone through many balance changes over the years, but the worst was probably between March 21st, 2017 till November 16th, 2017. These were the dark days of her rifle only dealing 60 damage. To the untrained eye, it doesn't seem that bad, but that breakpoint between 60 and 70 is very critical in Overwatch since most heroes are 200 HP. The 60 damage biotic rifle meant that after 3 shots, 200 HP enemies would only take 180 and live, compared to 210 and die. Healing was marginally better at 75, but the ammo count was lower at 10, and your shots would not pass through full HP allies. That meant if Rein's giant full HP dumpy was in your face while you tried to heal your diving tracer in the enemy backline, she was shit out of luck. Moving on, Sleep Dart, just an extra second, and Bionade suffered from the giant Rein dumpy problems by eating half your nades even though he was at full HP. Nano Boost was a lot cheaper at 1650 points, but this was also the weak period with no unique nano characteristic. This weak state of Ana was after the speed boost nerf, but before the healing buff. So Nano was in this limbo, for lack of a better term, and exclusively used for the damage buff and damage reduction only. Well, isn't this a surprise? Bap is currently in his weakest state and has been since July 1st, 2021, yet he's still a very strong pick and ranked. That just goes to show how overtuned he was on his release, and you can check out the strongest state video to see how his profile looked during his prime. Not much to say here, this is his profile now with the nerfed immortality field and a bunch of other minor tweaks to the rest of his kit, but he just gets so much value because it's so versatile. Brig is another hero that is, by raw numbers, in her weakest iteration right now and has been since November 19th, 2020. That November patch was when her 225 health got reverted back to 200, but despite all the nerfs before that, she's still commonly played and paired with Zen in the Ball D.Va dive comps. Please watch the strongest state video to see what she looked like in her prime. It was ridiculous, but for now, this is her current day profile. Lucio in 2016 was popular for 2 reasons. 1, he just had to exist to get value with the 30 meter range aura, and 2, DSP stanky. However, when looking at Lucio's state objectively between November 15, 2016 till April 11, 2017, this was his worst state. His sonic amplifier was 25% weaker in both its damage and projectile speed, and that slower projectile speed also lent itself to a slightly slower rate of fire at 1 burst a second. Soundwave, the boop ability, also cost 4 ammo instead of being completely free to use today, plus you can actually use it while reloading right now. Crossfade is his passive aura, in which it healed everybody a flat 12.5 HP per second in 2016, but right now, it actually heals allies at a higher rate of 16 per second. Speed boost was better back then though, at 30%, along with the giant aura of the 30 meters like we mentioned earlier. His amp it up also scaled with the crossfade healing, so it's only natural it was a flat 40 HP per second, while allies received more at 52 HP per second. Now onto his passive. Believe it or not, Lucio used to not gain any bonus speed while on walls. It's quite easy to spot once you watch old videos of it and now that you're aware of it. Just look at this footage from DSP Stanky trying to wall ride the back of Eichenwald. You could just tell it's way slower than it used to be. Sound Barrier was cheaper at 2625 points to build, but granted 250 less temp shields at 500. Mercy went through many polarizing balance patches in her history with endless posts about mass res or her initial rework build. However, there probably weren't as many posts bringing up her worst state, but that's what this video is for. August 9th, 2018 till November 14, 2018 was a time when Mercy's healing was at 50 HP per second, which also affected her Valkyrie chain healing beam as well. Now, 50 HP per second negatively affected Mercy in a ton of matchups, such as Winston, who deals 60 DPS. Fortunately, it has been buffed back up 10% to 55 HP per second. But other than that, Valk actually cost even more during her worst state at 1950 points, and to top it off, the chain healing and damage boost beam would break its tether after a few seconds if there was a barrier between them. This was super annoying back then because you'd constantly have to refresh your beam onto someone, and has luckily since been removed. With enough time though, people have come around to realize that Mercy can still be played with the right DPS pairing. The release of Echo and Ashe certainly helped Mercy get a lot more playtime despite her weakened state relative to that first overpowered Valkyrie rework. Moira was a strong support choice throughout most of GOAT and early into role lock double shield because of the piercing nature of her orbs and coalescence. It was unfortunate that Blizzard eventually ended up nerfing a large portion of her healing and biotic grasp attach angle by 37% on August 31st, 2020, marking the starting point of her worst state. This lasted up until November 19th when Blizzard realized they probably went a little too far, and then they rebuffed a small part of her healing just to see where that would land them. Nonetheless, this is what her worst state looked like compared to today, in which Moira is still pretty bad relative to other supports and is seldom played in high elo games. Biotic Grasp used to consume more of her resource meter at 14% per second. The self-healing was lower at 20, the Biotic Orb cooldown was longer, she couldn't jump at the end of her fade, and Biotic Grasp's resource meter would not get the 3x bonus of regen while using her ult. The only thing better about the weakest state of Moira was her coalescence cost at 2380 points. This does actually play a strong factor in why Moira isn't popular today, because you just lose out on first support ult tempo with that ridiculous 2800 cost. If you watch the strongest state video, you'd know that I marked Zen's strongest state beginning on July 19, 2016, which conveniently marks the end of Zen's weakest state. You see, Zen was released with the first build of the game on May 24, 2016, and up until that multi-buff patch for Zen on July 19th, he was bad. Like, really bad. We all know how vulnerable and squishy Zen is today at 200 HP, but imagine being only at 150 HP. This was one of the most significant factors when I considered this as his worst state. But it gets worse though if we go down the list. His primary fire orb used to only deal 45 damage compared to 48. His orb volley was also significantly weaker at 35 an orb, it took longer to charge up, and had weapon spread. The only upside to it was the marginal increase in its fire rate. When looking at his Harmony and Discord orbs, they had super slow travel times at 30 meters per second, making it feel super clunky. The only major upside was that Discord orb was at 50%, which in hindsight was absolutely insane. Players were still too new at the game to take advantage of that giant debuff, so it wasn't a big point of contention when considering his balance until players got better at target focus over the years to eventually bring it down to its 25% today. Transcendence costs 40% more today relative to its old 1650 points, but it was not as potent. The healing was 33% lower at 200 HP per second, which allowed specific abilities to burst through it like Hanzo's Dragon Strike. You were also stuck at your base movement speed, preventing you from running in and out to get teammates in its 10-meter healing range. In short, Zen was just not good during his first 6 weeks of Overwatch, and we saw too much Lucio and Mercy dominate the healer choices. Thanks for watching, everybody. My socials are linked right here. It's going to be my TikTok, Twitch, Instagram, Twitter, KarQ games almost everywhere except for Twitch. Appreciate it, and I'll see you guys next time.